Sure. Who? 1962, I started preaching full-time in Oklahoma. Two things they required of me. I'd learned to drink black coffee and play 42. I knew how to play 42. My dad taught me that, grew up on it. My partner was not a member of the church. His wife was, his mother-in-law was, and his mother-in-law's dad was one of my elders. So he was a pretty good fellow. On Friday nights, we frequently played 42. And one day, he ran across this verse. It's better to give than to receive. That's from Acts 20 and 35. It's better to give than to receive. He decided he had checked that out. And he did. And it did. I don't know exactly, but he was a pumper in the oil patch. And in the oil patch, when the pump goes down and you live right next door to it, you wake up and you go out and you restart it because the boss is losing money. He was giving away tools, I assume, tools of that nature. He said the more he gave away, the more came back. I decided, I think I'll try that. I did, and sure enough, it works. They all work, but that one especially. The more I gave away, the more it came back. It's more of an inner feeling, too. It feels good. You ever watch a child's eyes when you give something special to them? You have to get up early to find something that's more pleasing to watch a child's eyes just glisten. Matthew was a tax collector. Tax collectors worked for the Roman government. Matthew was obviously a Jew. Tax collectors were trained in condensing, and condensing. And when Matthew got around to writing the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew 5 through 7, he says Jesus went up the side of the mountain and sat down and began to teach. Well, I've mentioned in several other lessons, wasn't the kind of mountain like Sandias. They were short. You could just kind of run right up the side, sit down, perfect place to teach. History does point out that sometimes people will just follow you around. No relationship to you, they just follow around. Matthew doesn't deal with that. But as he goes on in this chapter, the Sermon on the Mount, which seems to be a composite of all the things Jesus ever taught them, just rolled into one. Give us this day our daily bread. I thought Alan was going to steal my text. He didn't know what I was speaking of. Give us this day our daily bread. I don't want tomorrow's bread, Lord. I'll come back tomorrow and ask for that. And bread doesn't always mean just a loaf of bread. It can mean food, your sustenance, what God's giving us to sustain our bodies. Following that same line of thinking over to Matthew 7:11, ask and it shall be given to you, seek and ye shall find, knock and the door shall be opened unto you. What is he talking about? Well, probably several things, but the one that comes to my mind is on Bible studies. Someone to sit down with you and to learn about God. When I was teaching in Kansas, I'd always pick out my best students, pick an hour a week that they were out of class, and study. And this passage just kind of leaps off the page to me, sounding like that scene. The story was told of a little boy dying and going to heaven, looking around and seeing just tons and tons of gifts. He said, "What's all this about?" Someone said, "Oh, those are gifts that no one ever asked for." Well, I don't really think that's what this passage is addressing. I think Jesus was talking about spiritual gifts. We've covered this material before. He blessed his servants, his active servants, with a lot of wealth while in the old covenant. But you'll be hard pressed to find a lot of money being discussed in the new. It's the spiritual gifts. The indwelling of the Spirit is our comfort. He gives us the peace that passeth understanding. That's the greatest wealth that we can find. Back in 1968, I was working on my master's thesis. And 2 chapters in that thesis was on the providence of God. We don't use the word miracle a whole lot these days. Nobody's still out there walking on the water. Nobody feeding 5,000 people with a sack lunch. But God's still active. God's still alive. He's still working behind the scenes, making things happen. He doesn't have less power. We rarely recognize it when it happens, but He's still there. While I was living there in Abilene, I had a particular neighbor. He was a truck driver. Nothing wrong with that. My dad was a truck driver. They're like a carpenter, feeding the kids. Only problem was he drank up all of his profits. Report got out that his children were going to school barefooted in the wintertime. Some of you can remember, well, let's just see. I don't know where you were when you were in, say, middle school, elementary. Everybody went barefooted. Any of you do that? Nobody went barefoot? Hey, I see a couple. Guess it depended where you lived. Well, I learned my wife buying shoes for those kids. Man, I was kind of filled with mixed emotions. Was I perpetuating his ability to get away with what he was doing? Then I decided, well, on her behalf, it was a noble thing that she did. I was just working part-time while I was in school. Another passage coming from Matthew 10. Freely you have received, freely give. So I guess that was okay. I would second what Mark said about giving to Tanzania. It's the best mission program, frankly, I ever ran onto. 5 adults. They look to us as their sponsor, so we need not to let them down. One day a young man came up to Jesus. Good teacher, what do I need, or what lack I yet? Good old King James language. I cut my teeth on it. A lot of people will be in heaven for reading King James. It's a good translation, just has a few words in it that we don't use anymore. We may stumble a little. Jesus said, if you want to be perfect, go sell your possessions and give to the poor, and you will have treasure in heaven. Then come follow me. That's a mouthful. If you want to be perfect. I met a young man once, and he said, I don't want to be perfect. I just want to barely get in. You'd be a miserable Christian if that's your philosophy. Let's look at that verse. I'm a law keeper. I keep the law. Jesus looked into his heart, though, and could see that things were in his way. His much money. He's called the rich young ruler. That word perfect is almost a stumbling block. Maybe a better word would have been mature, complete, full grown. There were about 5 men that I found. They were called perfect. Unless you're talking directly to God, and then that word perfect is absolutely correct. And if you're talking to a baptized believer who has the blood atoning for his sins and the Spirit in his heart, you could say he's perfect only because of the blood of Christ. I like that part about come follow me. He was a good fellow. What if Jesus had said to the church at large, go sell everything you have and give to the poor? Well, he didn't. We'd all be stranded. A lot of people, when we started our mission work right at the eve of World War II over in Europe, a lot of the soldier boys, a lot of wealthy people pumped money into that part of the world. So money can be a blessing. But if you're taking a look at faith only, and then he says, and then come follow me, there's action involved. We always want to remember that. Just getting us ready to go out and serve God. Just a note on our prayer life. I think our prayers are fine. Sometimes I think maybe we stop too early, maybe at the Lord's table. We talk a lot about pain. Those Romans meant for that to be pain. In fact, they invented the most painful thing around. You suffocated. You couldn't get air in your lungs. It was a miserable. But it was a bittersweet concept. It was also the greatest thing God ever gave anybody. We sometimes call it grace. Sometimes we call it salvation. You see, it's a package deal. It's a combination of the pain he went through for us, but it's the greatest gift God ever gave. First time I ever heard anyone combine that with the word celebration, it kind of offended me. Well, that's not a time. That's not a party time. Well, it wasn't meant to be a party. It was meant to be a time of expression, an expression to God. But take that thought home and analyze it. It's a celebration of the bitter and the sweet. Sometimes prophecy can be very reassuring. Mark 13:31. Heaven and earth shall pass away, but my word will not pass away. You think about it. I know it's been mentioned a half a dozen times by Robert and Haskell and myself. Manuscripts all over the world, at least 5,000 behind bars in these museums. That's comforting to know. There are a lot of people trying to put Christians out of business. It seemed to me that it was Voltaire, not sure if that was him, about 100 years ago, tried his best to stamp out the Bible. Today his home is being used to print Bibles. Just thought that was interesting. When I was about the 8th grade, I played quite a bit of basketball, about 6,000 or 8,000 calories ago. This young man, he was a couple of grades younger, he came up and he planted his fist in my stomach. You don't think through those things. You just come back. Caught him in the jaw, and he never did bother me again. But I haven't figured out why he did that either. There was nothing going on between us. Then I read 1 Corinthians 7:15. God called us to live in peace. We're not to be warmongers or out looking for a fight. But if you want to read about the civil authorities and how God takes care of those ruffians who would run over any of us, read Romans 13. Whole chapters about the powers that be. And God is still in control, and they are called His ministers. Go read Romans 13. First Corinthians 7:19. Keeping God's commands is what counts. I remember exactly what translation I took that out of. Keeping God's commands is what counts. Reminds us of Coca-Cola. It's the real thing. Christianity is the real thing. Drop down 4 verses from there. You were bought with a price. Do not become slaves to men. You get to hearing someone, don't abuse your body. Don't put things into your body that are harmful to you. Because we belong to Christ. We're His. It's the house of the Spirit. That would be a terrible thing to abuse our bodies. 1 Corinthians 10:13. When you are tempted, He will provide a way out so that you can stand up under it. I just used the last half of that verse. First half is very pretty. God is our helper. He will take care of us. He will give us the strength and the energy to follow Him. Some of these thoughts are tough. But those Corinthians, they didn't have a spiritual background. Aphrodite and a couple of other gods was all they knew. So he had to teach the basics. 1 Corinthians especially was designed to deal with those basics. Let's you and I do our part in teaching others by the way we live, as well as through the Word. I don't know whether you're sitting there hurting, something in your family that's not quite right, something you wish would go away, but it hasn't. It just keeps on hanging on, doesn't go away. It's a good time for prayer. I don't know anyone who is ready or prepared this morning to be baptized, but if you are, this would be a lovely time for that. Would you come as we stand and sing?